The next episode of Children of Heroes brought us all the way to Conway in North Wales, where we interviewed Mr Steven Liska, son of Flight Lieutenant Jaroslav Liška.
Thank you for participating in our project Children of Heroes.
You're very welcome.
Your father served as a virus operator with Bomber Command during the Second World War. Could you tell us more about him?
Born in Rushkopov, 6th of January 17, to Joseph. He was a conscript in the Austro-Hungarian army. On the 10th of January, the telegram telling Joseph that Dad had been born reached him, but he didn't see out the end of the day. He was killed in an avalanche. And then his mother, my grandmother Anna, died in 1920, so he was adopted and was destined for the priesthood. His older brother Bohos was already in the Air Force and took Dad up in a biplane fighter one day and did aerobatics with Dad, threw him all over the place. And Dad, being Dad, absolutely loved it. So he joined the Air Force. They had uninvited guests in 1939, and President Beneš, in his wisdom, told them not to resist. A lot of the Czechs thought, don't like this, we're going to escape. They got, in Dad's case, across the border into Poland. 4 of them in his little group joined the Foreign Legion in Krakow. And then they sailed eventually from Gdansk, I think. So they got to France, and then they were at Agde, I believe, and Tours. Some of these are French uniforms. The Czechs, should they be captured, they were treated as traitors to the Third Reich. So they were told to speak French and claim to be Canadian. Then France fell, and they managed to escape again, and they landed at Falmouth. And he joined the RAF and Lloyd's Bank in Cornwall. Dad was actually a navigator, but he was then converted to wireless operator. And he was the first Czech airman to reach 200 hours. I believe he did 205 hours and 50 minutes. And apparently they used to point at him when he came through the mess and say, "Flight Lieutenant Liška is still alive." When Dad met my mum, she was living at this address. And after the war, the chest went back to that address. I apologise for the condition of this. So that was Dad's tunic. That's the May West, the life jacket.
It's very heavy.
Size large, Flight Lieutenant Liška. And in the bottom of the box, you'll see outlines of aircraft and a list of aircraft, presumably for reminding observers of silhouettes of planes that could be enemies. He finished with Bomber Command, and then he went on to Battery Command, which apparently was an invention of Lord Beaverbrook, who was commissioned by Churchill to replenish British losses with American bombers. They were actually taking them to bits and shipping them across, and Beaverbrook, quite reasonably I think, said, hang on, they're planes, why don't you just fly them? I think the answer was they haven't got the range and it's a bit dodgy, you know. And he had a word with the aircraft manufacturers, and they agreed to fit extra tanks. And from what I understand, the first time they tried it, they flew 7 Hudson bombers. So these 7 Hudsons arrived safely, but they didn't all arrive safely. It was a pretty dodgy gig because they had to fly very high to save fuel. That risked icing becoming a problem. And on one mission, Dad noticed that Václav Korda, the pilot, that his oxygen had failed. And Korda noticed at the same instant, dived down to 10,000 feet. So, whoopee, we can breathe now. Trouble is, fuel consumption's gone up. So, I mean, if they'd ditched out in the Atlantic, that would have been it. But yeah, he and Korda, they did the first transatlantic trip with the Czech air crew. The famous photo of Korda, Dad and General Janáček is when they're getting the award for the first transatlantic flight. I asked him once, what did you do for going to the toilet on these long anti-submarine sweeps? He said, oh no, we didn't go. I said, you're joking. He said there was one, 18 hours, and they weren't able to go to the toilet. I said, what? He insisted that was the case. So I've got pictures that he took from the cockpits going over Greenland, Gronska, and then he got back to Britain. He went down to Tolbenny in Wales, which is near Haverfordwest in Pembrokeshire, and it was still 311, but they were then Coastal Command. In about 05, 06, I took Dad back down there and we found out where they'd lived, and we met a lovely local farmer called Gerald Gibby, who remembered the Czechs at Tolbenny. And he actually remembered hearing a Wellington crash on takeoff one morning. That was actually Uncle Bohuš crashing it. And apparently they all rushed out of the buildings to go and find the plane, and it was empty. There was nobody there. They'd all walked back to the mess. Luckily, they were not injured, and I think the co-pilot was blamed for having operated the flaps wrongly or something. Yeah, he also remembered that the German submarines used to come in under cover of darkness and fill up their fresh water tanks from the springs coming down the cliffs on the Pembrokeshire coast. And he remembered looking up and seeing German aircrew waving at the children on the ground on their way to bomb Pembroke and Milford Haven. I've got quite a few pictures. Most of the ones I've got are ones Dad took himself. He bought a Leica camera in Canada, so he took a lot of pictures. There's Benesh at Wrexham. There's King and Queen at Wrexham, for example. This is Mum and Dad's wedding. That's Bohuš there. They went back to Czechoslovakia. His medals were apparently sent back by the RAF to Prague. They all disappeared.
He went back to Czechoslovakia
with Mum.
1945.
45, yeah. With Mum and Anna. Yeah, and he was still in the Air Force. And of course the Russians were very much in evidence. And there was one occasion where his car was stopped by a Russian soldier who was waving a gun around, and Dad said, if I could have got to my gun, I would have shot him. He did it to try and save his country, and then his country was stolen again from under his nose.
His family became the victim of
it would have been. Well, Bohuš certainly was. Bohuš was much higher up. He was a colonel. When Bohuš had organised the escape routes of the Czechs, and the idea was that he would follow on and meet up with Dad, he stayed behind because he was convinced by Svoboda, who was ultimately the president. So he convinced Bohuš to stay with him, and eventually they were captured by the Russians. The persecution in his case amounted to being demoted, and the order was actually signed by Svoboda. Bohuš was imprisoned for, I think, 12 or 18 months in solitary confinement. What had he done? He tried to save his country. All 4,500 or however many there were just trying to save their country. Dad, however, being married to an Englishwoman, apparently that made it a lot easier for him to come back to England, which they did. His mum's passport formed. Well, of course, Mum being English but married to a Czech airman was treated as an alien.
What did he do after?
He went into business, initially importing fruit. He had an office in Borough Market in South London, but then the communist putsch happened and they nationalised everything. So that was the business gone. Then he set up his own business eventually, and it was still import-export, and he needed a name, so I thought L for Liska, X for export, M for import, so it became Lexim.
You have volunteered in several hospitals.
In my 20s, I used to organise charity walks every year for various causes. I went to volunteer at Stoke Mandeville spinal injuries unit. I went one night a week for about 18 months. Sobering experience. A lot of people very, very badly disabled through the most innocuous reasons. And then in the early 2000s, I volunteered at a wildlife hospital, also near Aylesbury, which I absolutely adored, looking after wild animals in particular. There's just something very magical about being near wild animals, especially foxes, being a Liška.
You write and have recently finished a book.
Yes.
What is the book about?
Yes, about Linda's stroke, yeah. I thought it was a good idea to get it down on record, what happens after a stroke, to everybody concerned, really. So I ended up with about 18,000 words and lots of coloured pictures. And I wanted the money, any royalties that may accrue, to go to this specific charity, Animal Free Research. And as I say, the next one is to finish Dad's history.
We are approaching the end of our interview. Do you have anything to add?
He looked out on VE Day at all the crowds celebrating, and he said, I thought to myself, what was all that about? All that death and destruction? And it all started up again, isn't it?